The council chamber floated in space like a giant sphere made of metal and glass, where 73 different species had gathered to discuss a problem that worried them all. And that problem was humanity, who had appeared among the stars only. 60 years ago, but already caused trouble nobody could understand Claire. Matthews entered through the massive doors, and she walked. Alone with only a data tablet in her hands, and her clothing was simple and professional, and her face showed nothing at all, and no fear, and no anger, and no worry touched her expression as she smiled at the assembled delegates like they were old friends meeting for tea-high. Above, in the shadowed galleries, sat someone who had been watching and waiting for a very long time, and her name was Lyria Ashenvale, and her silver hair fell around shoulders that had lived through 2 centuries of hiding, and her violet eyes tracked every single movement below with an intensity that could burn through steel if she wanted it to, and nobody noticed her sitting there, because nobody ever did. Any more coiled in the support beams above the elf-woman was a dragon who slept with his scales, catching no light at all, and Vex was small compared to the dragons of legend. Being no larger than a human child, but his age stretched back further than most civilizations in the room, and when his eyes opened, they glowed like melted gold, and he dreamed of forests that had burned and skies that had turned black with smoke. 200 years before the High Arbiter rose from the center platform, and Nixilor was made entirely of living crystal that shifted colors like emotions. Given physical form, and the being spoke in a voice that made the air itself vibrate with sound, and the message was simple and clear and direct: humanity must submit to dominion, oversight, or face the consequences, and those consequences meant extinction. 17 species nodded immediately in agreement, and 23 stayed silent, while watching everything carefully, and the remaining species whispered to each other in languages that ranged from clicking sounds to musical tones to telepathic pulses. Claire stood when they called her name, and she smoothed down her jacket with hands that never shook. And then she asked a question that made the entire chamber fall into absolute silence, and she asked if anyone wanted to know what happened to the 7th Fleet. The 7th Fleet had vanished exactly 3 months ago in 12,000 Dominion warships had simply disappeared from every tracking system and sensor array and communication network in known space, and no distress calls came through, and no debris fields were found, and no evidence existed to explain their fate. Up in the gallery, Lyria leaned forward with interest, and Vex opened one golden eye to watch Claire began showing images that appeared in the air above the council floor, and holographic projections displayed human colonies spreading across star systems like seeds scattered by wind, and cities rose on worlds that should have been impossible to settle on orbital stations. Circled gas giants and binary stars, and ships moved through space carrying goods and people and hope, but the numbers were wrong, and every intelligence agency from every species present had reported that humanity controlled 47 systems, and yet Claire showed them 73 functioning colonies with full populations and industrial capacity. She explained politely that perhaps others had been looking at incomplete data, and that humanity had been rather busy over the past 5 years. The next images showed production numbers that should have been impossible, and shipyards the size of moons, and factories that stretched across entire asteroid belts, and industrial output that should have required centuries to build, and yet humanity had only been traveling between stars for 60 years. Reptilian delegate named Croth stood up fast, and his scales bristled with agitation and anger, and he declared it impossible, and humanity lacked the resources and the technology, and most importantly, the time needed to build what Claire was showing them. Claire nodded and agreed that Croth was correct about 2 of those 3 things, but she did not explain which to Illyria. Whispered something in the ancient language that only dragons and elves remembered, and Vex extended his senses outward in ways that humans could never understand, and he felt the emotional state of every being in the chamber, and he confirmed what Lyria already suspected, and Claire Matthews felt absolutely no fear, though. Presentation continued with star maps appearing next, and they showed trade routes that connected distant sectors and fleet movements that should have been classified, and then Claire displayed something that made half the delegates jump to their feet in shock and alarm, complete in detailed schematics of every Dominion fleet position for the previous 5 years, and movement patterns and supply routes and communication protocols and information that should have been impossible for any species to obtain, and especially impossible for humanity to possess. Claire asked again if they wanted to discuss. What happened to the 7th Fleet Hexler pulsed with colors that meant confusion and fear and anger, and demanded to know if Claire was threatening the Council with military action. Claire said calmly that no threat was being made, and she was simply offering everyone in the room a choice they had never been given before. Execs of the Hive Collective spoke next, and his insectoid body clicked and chittered with nervous energy, and he asked what kind of choice Prey could possibly offer to predators. The expression on Claire Matthews' face changed then, not to fear but to something much colder and harder, like steel being forged in fire, and she said, the choice was for everyone to stop being predators. Then something happened that nobody expected, and Lyria Ashenvale stood up from her hidden position in the upper gallery and revealed herself for the first time in 2 centuries, and the room erupted into complete chaos, because an elf was supposed to be extinct and the species had been wiped out by the Dominion, and yet here stood living proof that they survived. And then Vex shimmered into visibility, beside her with scales that seemed to absorb and reflect light at the same time, and the dragon presence sent half them delegates scrambling toward exits in panic. Lyria voice cut through the chaos like a sword through water, and she told everyone to be silent and let the human ambassador speak, because she very much wanted to hear what humanity had planned for all of them. Hours passed before order returned to the council chamber, and several species refused to come back inside, while others sent armed guards to stand watch near their delegations. But everyone wanted to know what would happen next, and curiosity was stronger than fear. Claire nodded once to Lyria in acknowledgement, and one mystery recognized another mystery, and then the human ambassador continued with her presentation, explained that humanity had spent 5 full years studying everyone, and betrayal that had occurred between species, and the patterns became clear very quickly. Dominion maintained total control through fear and through keeping alliances broken and scattered and weak, and 70% of the species in this chamber had lost colonies to Dominion protection policies, and this council was not really a government at all, but an endless hostage situation that never resolved. So humanity created detailed plans for every single species present, though. Holographic display split apart into 73 different screens, and each one showed a species name at the top, and below that came detailed information that should have been secret, and military capabilities were listed, and economic vulnerabilities were noted, and cultural pressure points were identified, and secret alliances were exposed, and hidden colonies were marked on maps. Claire began with territories, and she explained how the Dominion had been secretly supplying weapons to rebel queens and keeping the entire collective dependent on peacekeeping forces they did not want or need. Zix's compound eyes grew wide with shock, because that information had been sealed in the deepest and most secure archives of his entire civilization. Claire moved to the next species without pausing, and their primary food source was failing because the dying star they orbited could no longer produce the radiation they needed to survive, and the Dominion knew about this problem and was charging them triple the normal price for synthetic. Alternative vehicle colors flashed through rapid patterns that indicated distress and confusion and betrayal and fear. One species after another heard their deepest secrets revealed, and Claire did not make threats, but simply stated facts, and she showed evidence of manipulation and exploitation that the Dominion had used against everyone, and communication intercepts appeared on screens, and financial records scrolled past, and surveillance footage played that should never have existed outside Dominion database. Croth demanded loudly to know how humanity had obtained this information from high in the gallery. Lyria answered, and her voice carried easily through the massive space, and she said it was because humans listened, and humans were very good at finding things that others wanted to keep. Hidden Vex made a sound that rumbled deep in his chest, and it might have been agreement or amusement or both. Claire thanked the elf woman with a nod, and then explained that for 5 years, while everyone thought humanity was barely surviving and scrambling to establish themselves among the stars. They had actually been building something else. Entirely inhuman freighter. Ships had visited every corner of known space, and human engineers had worked on space stations across thousands of worlds, and human diplomats had made friends in very low places where important people never looked. She pulled up a new display that showed a completely different kind of fleet, and these were not warships designed for battle, but construction vessels and hospital ships and agricultural platforms and mobile factories, and hundreds of these. Support craft were positioned throughout the entire galaxy in places where nobody had been watching. Claire said that humanity had built specific plans, tailored for every species in this chamber, and the plans were not designed for conquest or domination, but for something the Dominion never offered, and that something was liberation before anyone could respond. Lyria spoke again, and she descended from the upper gallery with Vex gliding silently beside her on wings that made no sound at all, and delegates pulled back from the dragon. Even though he made no threatening gestures or movements, Lyria addressed Claire directly and told her that she had come to this meeting expecting to watch humanity grovel and beg and submit, just as her own people had done before the Dominion burned their forests and shattered their sacred crystal groves, and she expected to witness the death of another young and naive species. She walked through the assembled delegates in her presence, commanded attention in a way that made everyone understand. She was far older than her youthful appearance suggested, but instead of watching humanity break, Lyria said she had seen something she had not witnessed in 2 full centuries, and that was a species refusing to play the game by the rules that had been forced upon them. Vex landed directly on the central platform right beside Claire, and the human ambassador did not flinch away or show any sign of fear, and the dragon leaned forward to study her with eyes that had watched and fallen. Turned to Duscelaria, continued speaking, and explained that Vex was one of only 3 dragons still alive from her world, and when the Dominion arrived at their planet, there had been no negotiations and no offers and no choices presented, and the Dominion simply took everything they wanted, and her people fought back with ancient magic and with courage that songs would remember, but they lost anyway, and they lost everything. Her voice carried pain that time could never fully heal. But Lyria said she understood now that her people had fought the wrong kind of battle, and they had defended their homes and reacted to attacks, but they never stopped to consider changing the fundamental rules of engagement. She turned to address every delegate in the chamber and told them that humanity had spent 5 years quietly turning their prison into a network of connections, and every species had been isolated and played against each other and kept weak and frightened and divided. But this ambassador was now showing them something the Dominion never wanted anyone to see: a complete map of everyone's strengths and weaknesses, but not to exploit those vulnerabilities, and instead to connect them together into something stronger. Breathed outward, and a wave of energy washed across the entire chamber, and it was not threatening or harmful, but cleansing and purifying in ancient magic. Revealed hidden listening devices and concealed weapons and cloaked Dominion observers lurking in the shadows, and security drones fell from the ceiling, suddenly powerless, and spy satellites beyond the station hull flickered once and died forever. Claire spoke into the shocked silence that followed, and she told them plainly that they wanted to know what happened to the 7th Fleet, and now she would explain. And 3 months ago, that massive Dominion fleet encountered combined forces from 17 different human battle groups that were operating under total communications blackout, and the Dominion command still did not know where the attacks originated from, and they had been searching completely wrong sectors for months, but humanity had not destroyed the 7th Fleet, and that was the important detail, and instead they captured every single ship and every single crew member, and for 3 months, human interrogators had been asking very specific questions and learning classified protocols and breaking encryption codes and gathering intelligence. The implications of this crashed through the council chamber like a physical shockwave. Claire continued calmly and explained that when the Dominion sent their next fleet to investigate this council session, they would receive a transmission, and the security codes in that transmission would verify perfectly against every authentication system, and those codes would direct the incoming fleet to a staging area where nothing good would be waiting for them. Thexler protested that this plan was complete madness because the Dominion controlled 6,000 star systems and they commanded fleets that dwarfed anything anyone in this room had ever seen. Claire agreed completely and said that was exactly why humanity had no intention of fighting the Dominion alone. She activated her final presentation, and a star map appeared that looked different from anything the Council had seen before, and it showed a vast network of connections linking worlds and species and resources and trading partners, and at the very center was not Earth and not humanity, but an empty space waiting to be filled by something nuclear. Explained what humanity was proposing, and it was a real alliance built on actual mutual interests and shared strength, and not a hostage negotiation, and not a protection scheme that benefited only the Dominion. She began highlighting different species' capabilities on the map and pointed out the hive, collective biological engineering expertise, and the crystalline hierarchy, energy manipulation abilities, and the reptilian Concord advanced metallurgy, and dozens of other specialties that were scattered among all the assembled species separately. Claire said each species remained vulnerable to Dominion pressure and threats and economic manipulation, but together they represented something powerful enough to completely rewrite the balance of power throughout the entire galaxies. Ix asked suspiciously what humanity expected to gain from this proposed arrangement. Claire answered with complete simplicity and said, humanity wanted exactly the same thing everyone else wanted, and that was freedom to grow and develop without someone boot-pressing down on their necks, and a chance to build something better than endless cycles of exploitation and fear. Lyria stepped forward too, stand beside the human ambassador, and it was a gesture that everyone in the chamber noticed and understood, and she announced that Claire spoke truth in Lyria, had walked among humans for 3 full years while hiding and watching and waiting for them to reveal their true nature. She had seen human cities and human slums and witnessed their generosity and their greed and their kindness and their cruelty. Vex unfurled his wings, and they suddenly seemed much larger than before and cast shadows that stretched across the entire assembly. Lyria continued and said that humans were definitely not perfect, but they were also not conquerors, seeking to dominate others. And when she had finally revealed herself to their government, while desperate and alone and frightened, they did not imprison her. And they did not study her like some laboratory specimen, and instead they asked how they could help rebuild what her people had lost. She looked at Claire with obvious respect showing in her ancient eyes and said that humanity then asked if Lyria would help them ensure that no other species would ever suffer the way hers had suffered. The holographic display changed one final time and showed construction projects on a massive scale and shipyards hidden deep inside nebulae and weapons platforms, cleverly disguised as mining facilities and fleet assets. That completely dwarfed what Claire had shown earlier, but also hospitals and schools and hydroponic farms and terraforming equipment. Claire explained that every species had detailed files in human databases, and those files contained not just military vulnerabilities, but also hopes and goals and dreams that people used to have before the Dominion made everyone too afraid to dream anymore. Humanity had been steadily building toward achieving those forgotten goals and creating infrastructure specifically tailored to different species' needs and developing technology adapted for various biologies and designing economic plans that would benefit people rather than exploit them. This was the choice being offered, and species could stay in the Council exactly as it currently existed and continue their careful dance around Dominion demands while hoping to remain valuable enough not to be destroyed. Or they could stand together and build the coalition and take back their autonome. Mycroft asked what would happen if species refused this offer. Claire's expression showed no anger, but only sad understanding. And she said that humanity still fight against the Dominion and still work to break their control over the galaxy, but they would do it without help, and everyone else would remain completely at the Dominion mercy. Vexilor spoke very carefully and pointed out that if species accepted this proposal, the Dominion would definitely retaliate, and that retaliation would be directed against everyone who joined. Claire confirmed this assessment immediately and said, That was exactly why humanity had spent 5 full years preparing for that inevitable retaliation, and the files currently being transmitted to every delegation contained detailed battle plans and evacuation protocols and defensive strategies, specifically designed for protecting core worlds. Humanity was not asking anyone to join a suicide mission, but offering a comprehensive war plan that could actually achieve victory. The chamber erupted into loud debate, and species argued fiercely among themselves and with each other, but something fundamental had shifted in the room, and for the first time in living memory. They were not discussing how to appease the Dominion, but instead arguing about how to resist them. Lyria watched everything unfold from her position beside Claire, and Vex had coiled around her shoulders now and appeared small and gentle, like a pet rather than an ancient weapon of war, and the elf woman caught Claire eye and nodded once with approval. The human ambassador had accomplished something Lyria could never achieve alone, and she had made an entire galaxy of defeated species believe that winning was actually possible. 3 hours passed in intense discussion and negotiation, and finally 47 different species came forward to sign the coalition charter, and their representatives placed marks and seals and genetic signatures on the document that would change galactic history. 17 species refused outright, and their delegates fled the station as quickly as their ships could carry them away from what they considered madness and treason. 9 species abstained from voting and chose to wait and watch to see which direction events would ultimately flow before committing themselves. As Claire prepared to leave the council chamber, Lyria approached her one final time and stood close enough to speak privately. The elf woman said quietly that this decision meant war, and not small border skirmishes, but real total war of the kind that reshaped entire galaxies and destroyed civilizations and killed billions. Claire said simply that she knew. Lyria asked if humanity was truly prepared for what that would cost and for the price that would be demanded in blood and treasure and lives. Claire's calm facade cracked just slightly and showed the enormous weight she had been carrying, and she answered honestly that no, they were not prepared, and nobody could ever really be prepared for something like this, but humanity was willing to pay the price anyway, because the alternative of endless submission was so much worse. Spoke then for the very first time, and his voice sounded like grinding stones and ancient wind and forgotten thunder, and he said that the young species showed unexpected wisdom. The Dominion had ruled through fear for 3,000 years, and that fear took many forms, and fear of loss, and fear of extinction, and fear of standing alone against overwhelming power. The dragon golden eyes fixed on Claire with an intensity that seemed to look straight through her body, to examine her soul, and he said that humanity has given the other species something far more powerful than fear, and that was hope of actual victory, and whether that hope was justified would remain to be seen, but it was definitely enough to start the fire that would burn across the stars. Lyria smiled then, and it was the first genuine smile she had shown in 2 centuries, and she told Claire that she would stay with humanity for a while longer, because someone needed to teach human warriors the old magic that her people had developed over millennia. If they were going to burn the Dominion down properly, they might as well use every tool available. Claire extended her hand in the human gesture of partnership, and Lyria grasped it firmly, and their handshake sealed an alliance between old magic and new determination. Above them, in the black void of space, human ships began emerging from faster-than-light travel, and they appeared in flashes of twisted light and released energy, and these were not warships bristling with weapons, but transport vessels and supply ships. They carried technology and medical equipment and food and raw materials and thousands of human personnel who would help the coalition species begin their preparations for the war that was coming. The war had not officially started yet, but something irrevocable had changed in the day Earth. Ambassador calmly revealed detailed plans for every species. Present was the day the galaxy stopped, belonging exclusively to the Dominion. In the darker sections of the station, where shadows gathered, thick, one of the 17 species that had fled the council made a transmission to Dominion space, and they reported everything they had witnessed in the coalition formation and the captured Seventh Fleet, and the threat that humanity represented. The message traveled through subspace channels at speeds faster than any physical ship could move. In her private quarters, Claire received notification that the transmission had been detected and sent, and she made no move to stop it or prevent it from reaching its destination. This had always been part of the plan, and humanity needed the Dominion to know, and needed them to respond, and needed them to commit forces to what they thought would be an easy suppression of rebellion. 3 days later, Dominion response fleets began mobilizing across 6,000 systems, and orders went out to eliminate the human threat and restore order to the Council and remind every species why resistance was futile, but the Dominion was responding to intelligence that was carefully crafted to mislead them, and human agents had spent 5 years planting false information and creating fake vulnerabilities and building an elaborate trap. The first battle of the Coalition happened near a system called Hope Reach, and humanity had chosen the name very deliberately, and 12 Dominion fleets arrived expecting to find scattered resistance, and instead found 47 species fighting together with coordinated tactics and shared intelligence and combined strength. The battle lasted 6 hours, and the Dominion forces retreated in confusion. News of the victory spread faster than light itself, and species across the galaxy began to reconsider their positions and wonder if resistance might actually be possible. Lyria stood on the bridge of a human command ship and watched the tactical displays in beside her. Vex had grown larger, and his wings now stretched wide enough to touch both walls, and ancient magic flowed through the vessel. Systems enhancing shields and strengthening weapons and connecting minds. Across vast distances, Claire was there too, and coordinating with dozens of allied commanders simultaneously, and her calm demeanor had been replaced with fierce determination. More battles followed across the months that came after, and the Dominion discovered that fighting a united coalition was completely different from suppressing individual species, and their traditional tactics of isolation and intimidation no longer worked. Human intelligence networks provided early warning of fleet movements, and Hive collective biological weapons disrupted Dominion supply lines, and crystalline hierarchy energy shields protected vulnerable colonies, and reptilian Concord armor plating strengthened coalition ships. Slowly and painfully, and with terrible cost, the balance of power began to shift. 2 years into the war, Lyria taught the first human students how to channel the old magic, and they learned slower than elves, but with determination that impressed even her, and Vex began teaching other humans how to bond with the few remaining dragons who had hidden across the galaxy. 5 years after the council meeting, the Dominion controlled only 4,000 systems, and their fleets were stretched thin, and their subject species were in open revolt, and their economy was collapsing under the weight of fighting on 1,000 fronts. Simultaneously, 10 years after Claire Matthews stood in that council chamber and calmly revealed plans for every species present, the Dominion finally sued for peace and accepted terms that stripped away their power to threaten and exploit and dominate. The galaxy was not perfect after the war, and old grudges still existed, and new conflicts emerged between species who had fought together, and peace required constant work and attention, but every species now had the freedom to choose their own path and build their own future and face their own challenges without someone else boot on their neck. Claire retired from diplomatic service and spent her remaining years teaching at the Aspecta Coalition Academy and training new generations in the art of strategic thinking and patient preparation. Lyria and Vex remained with humanity and became symbols of the alliance between old and new and magic and technology, and they watched as the galaxy slowly healed from centuries of exploitation. And sometimes on quiet nights, Lyria would remember that council chamber and the moment when everything changed, and she would smile knowing that one human woman with a data tablet and a calm voice had accomplished what armies could not. The day Earth Ambassador revealed plans for every species present became a holiday celebrated across 73 worlds, and children learned the story in schools, and artists painted murals showing Claire and Lyria standing together while Vex wings spread wide behind them. It was not a story of easy victory or simple solutions, but of Species choosing to stand together and face impossible odds because the alternative was worse than any death, and that choice made all the difference.